one of the things that
Yeah.
Ben Bickman told us is that a vegan diet is a diet of the elite, because you need to, first of all, have the education to know that you're going to be deficient in diets, and then you need the finances to go pay for the supplements that you're going to need to probably not even cover up those deficiencies anyway. I thought that was a really good way to look at it. Veganism is a diet
I
of the elite.
yeah, I love Ben Bickman's work, and I would say he's exactly right. The origins of vegetarianism, if you look at Eastern mysticism and going back to Pythagoras and Buddha and this concept, it was more about not eating animal protein, flesh meat, because of metempsychosis and this concept that, karma, the soul might go into an animal depending on your karma. And there were some stories where it was good to go into an animal. It was considered a great thing towards enlightenment. Other ones, it was a punishment, and then you had to work your way back up again. But either way, Pythagoras and Buddha both taught that if you ate an animal, you may be eating the soul of a relative or a friend. So they didn't include that, but they didn't say don't have any animal fats. They had milk, they had butter, they had ghee, they had all of those things, because you cannot survive without animal proteins and fats in some form. And so when we talk about Western vegetarianism, which began about the beginning of the 18th century, or 1800s, sorry, you're certainly looking at a group of people who were talking about flesh meat, and quite different to the metempsychosis. They were talking about spiritual purity and this concept that, the temperance health reformers at the beginning of the 1800s were really focused on intemperance, and they believed that alcohol and cigarettes and all sorts of things, but in particular, flesh meat would stir baser passions. It became this animalizing of people. People were much calmer, were much more malleable, I would suggest, if their brains are a little fogged and they're not having animal proteins and fats to really be at a peak physical and mental capacity. So they were encouraging people to not eat animal proteins, flesh meat. And it was a way of potentially controlling some of the people, getting them to think about things, quieten them down. And also they were very, very concerned about meat causing masturbation. And this was a real theme of the temperance health reform movement, which began in the 1800s. I would say it began from a bit of Swedenborgism and the UK, but William Cowherd came from the UK to the US and set it up, and that's when it really flourished in the US. So thanks for that.
Thanks.
So Ellen G. White wasn't the first person to talk about these things, and I think that's an important discussion. She tried to teach the church that she was getting all these visions from God, and this was important, and this was important at different stages. But a lot of the things that she brought into the doctrines of the church had already been discussed by other people well and truly before her time, certainly when she was young. And so I would say she was building on that. But instead of just discussing it like Sylvester Graham as an itinerant preacher on street corners, and his followers inventing graham crackers and different things to encourage people to eat bland cereals and grains and give away the flesh meat, she brought it into the doctrines of the church and determined that, fruit, nuts and seeds were the God-appointed diet for man. That's what she taught. Public health education was the commission of their church. They were the God-appointed church. They were the remnant church. They were the spiritual children of Israel. And if the original children of Israel had given up flesh meat and their desire for it, Jesus would have come back then. But she taught that he was telling her that he's not going to come back as a second coming until enough people give up flesh meat, because you'll be going back to the Garden of Eden. Your rebirth will be back to fruit, nuts and seeds. And if you're still like the children of Israel and wanting to eat meat, then you'll cause disruption up in heaven. This is not going to be a good thing. She taught that before translation, so this is really salvation, before translation, you will have to give up flesh meat. So they don't make it a necessary thing to be part of the church. You can join the church still eating meat, but they encourage people over time to to get rid of it. And there are Adventist health studies, and certainly the people at the top of the church are really pushing this message that you need to be vegan. And if you look at the, so not only do they talk about this, but they've incorporated the health and wellness. So medical evangelism is the right arm of the church, their health reform message, the entering wedge. They can open doors to hearts and minds of people that would have previously been closed to the gospel. So
Yeah.
they believe that they are Christ-like, but not understanding or really comprehending the fact that when Christ was on earth, as described in the Bible, he was performing miracles to heal people. He wasn't prescribing tablets. He wasn't, getting them in and talking to them about their diet. He was offering fishes and loaves. So I think, this is quite interesting. And if you consider that biblical Garden of Eden diet, which they really do hinge their whole belief on, this disregards the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy completely in the First Testament. They will not recognize that. It completely disregards the entire Second Testament of the Bible. It disregards ancestral diets and evolutionary hunter-gathering. They see no role for animal proteins or fats in the diet. And Ellen G. White was as bold to say that man's ideas of science are not evidence-based, because that's putting man's ideas of science above God. And in her mind, God's science was the biblical Garden of Eden diet, fruit, nuts, and seeds.
Wow.
And so you've got people involved in the church who've been just dedicated their entire lives to prove, not disprove, divine inspiration. And again, this idea of the Adventist health studies right now. So I've got examples all the way through, but the Adventist health studies right now, if you look at the fine print, it actually says that the term vegetarian actually means that you're having meat less than once a week, or meat, animal products, animal proteins. And to be vegan, it's less than once a month. But that isn't the message that they're giving to the public, Casey.
Nobody knows that. Nobody knows
that.
Wow.
And so this is potentially how they keep their health, because they're not completely getting rid of it. And they're doing a lot of other things that are good for their health. They don't smoke, they don't drink, they don't take drugs. They live in small communities, they're getting fresh air. All the other bits of their lifestyle complement the fact maybe that they're still incorporating those things into their diet, I believe, to maintain some level of health. But the people who are following in the church, and I've spoken to Seventh-day Adventists who are really, really sick because they're following it to the T and eating the church's processed foods.
Crazy. It's so crazy. I mean, just look around me here in Salt Lake City. We've got tons of Mormons around here. I can tell you, don't avoid meat at all, but they have a lot of the same practices. We talked about this last time.
Yes.
They don't drink, they don't smoke, and they have been shown to live just as long, if not longer, than the Adventists. The same with, I believe you talked about Orthodox Jews. It's a similar kind of a situation. And I love how you explained that. The way that you explained, like, this is why we're talking about visions that were had in the mid 1860s, but they still impact you today. You might not be an Adventist, but it impacts you today. What they thought about then still carries through to today. And it's kind of like I said in the last episode. It's like, who cares about all that stuff in the past? Well, you care. We all care, because it's still coming through. It's still part of the religion. They want Jesus to come back, which he's pretty finicky. He's decided to come back and not come back a bunch of times by now. About time he needs to come if he's going to. But anyway, it's so, I don't know. It's so interesting to see how all that impacts us today in 2022 still, because of everything that's happened, and because they still want to move that message forward, and they're not trying to hide it.
That's exactly right, Casey. Until you look back into history, you cannot understand where the plant-biased messaging is coming from in today's society. You honestly can't. And I think that was what I was just blown away with when I started looking at Sanitarium here in Australia, owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And as an aside, they pay no tax because it comes under the charity status of the church. So they pay no tax. I imagine worldwide, on their 21 food industries, which produce over 2,500 different products to take the place of flesh, meat, milk, and butter. And in Australia, Sanitarium pays no tax on their health and wellness programs, which they run in church and communities, and in corporate businesses, and the sanitarium health and wellness programs are run in America as well. So, it's like they're a hub. As I say, the footprint's really small, but their influence is massive. And sanitarium doesn't just go to America, it goes to Asia, the UK, and out into the South Pacific. Their influence out there, specifically with health and wellness programs, with their 10,000 Toes campaign, but it's under the umbrella of sanitarium. So people don't question because it's not under the umbrella of the church. It's how they get this message through. I was saying yesterday, they're the second biggest educators in the world, despite the fact there's only 21 million people actually as part of the church. So it's not a big church, and yet their influence is massive. And health and wellness education is just such a big part of this messaging. So I'll jump back to 1844 just quickly so people get a little bit of an idea. William Miller said it was going to be the end of the world in October 1843. And then when they reworked a few of the numbers, it became October 1844. Ellen G. White was part of a group. She was 17 years old at the time in 1844. Jesus didn't come back. Apparently there were 100,000 people who were completely believing that this was going to happen.
Wow.
Some people had sold their houses. Many people had given up their work. Most people had given up their other church. A lot of churchgoers, they'd given up their churches and come to be part of this Millerite movement. They were really thinking it was going to be the end. And so, oh my gosh, suddenly it wasn't the end. Ellen G. White had a vision that it wasn't the wrong date, it was the wrong event to explain it all. So this is where the Seventh-day Adventist Church was born out of this great disappointment. Sorry. Sorry. So this great disappointment happened. Her vision, God told her she was taken to heaven. She was told that atonement wasn't completed at the cross, which is what the Second Testament identifies. This is what Martin Luther was talking about. I mean, he's a Reformation. It's about faith, and this happened at the cross. Ellen G. White said, no, it didn't. It started there, but only a little bit. What happened was in 1844, Jesus moved from his holy place to his most holy place. He went to the second apartment, and there he started his work. And I was saying to Jake and Marion, the scary part is for a lot of people in the Seventh-day Adventist Church is you don't know. So say that your name came up yesterday, Casey, and Jesus went through and blotted out your sins, but you don't die for another 20 or 30 years. You have no intercessor in that time because your name's already been ticked off. So in that entire time, you are being considered, have you sinned? Have you said the wrong thing? Have you done all these things? I believe that's why works are so important as part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, why people have to be part of this medical evangelistic outreach. They say it's total member involvement. It isn't just the doctors. It isn't just dietitians. It isn't just nurses. It's every single person in that church has to be part of this medical evangelism and take it to a level where they can. So whether it's just talking to your neighbor about healthy cooking or vegetarianism or veganism, whether it's having cooking classes, whether it's doing all these things, whether it's running this CHIP program. And if you look at the facilitator guide, it's got meat, eggs, and dairy above alcohol and processed food as the toxins that provide the worst health outcomes. So every single person is immersed in this belief and immersed in telling this, because when they tell this story, when enough people give up meat, as we've spoken about, or are aware of it and can make the conscious decision, again, the church founded religious liberty. They were the ones who started the Sentinel magazine in the 1800s. They were the ones that founded the International Religious Liberty Association. And part of that was to protect themselves from the Sunday blue laws that were being talked about as being brought in. But they also wanted to become non-combatants in the Civil War. There's a whole lot of reasons that they began this religious liberty, but it's carried on today, and people probably don't realize it's the church They actually allow other church members or other people to be the president of the International Religious Liberty Association, but they're the CEO and they're most of the board members. It's
Wow.
still very much protecting the Seventh-day Adventist church beliefs. That's what it's been set up to do. But they allow people to have choice. And so they are protecting other religions as well. And this idea that it's a moral choice that you decide you're going to give up all of these things because that means that you are spiritually pure. And flesh meat, Ellen G. White taught, flesh meat defiled people, not only men, but women and children. And it defiled them spiritually, physically, and morally. So, this is a really, really powerful statement. And if you consider, I've mentioned that their diet wasn't possible till different foods were invented. Well, John Harvey Kellogg invented these foods. And his father had been part of the church from the beginning. He didn't send his children to school. John Harvey Kellogg didn't go to school because his father, they just kept teaching, it's about to be the end of the world. They're an apocalyptic church. Ellen G. White taught that it was going to happen in her lifetime. Jesus was going to come back. And the reason they blame that he hasn't come back is because not enough people have given up meat. This is why he's not coming back. So you look at John Harvey Kellogg, he was only 12 years old when he went to work for the first family of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He was 12 when he was typesetting her sermons, her testimonies to the church, and also this book, A Solemn Appeal to Mothers. In this book, she spoke only of mothers deterring their children from masturbation. And she blamed meat as the major cause. Not the only cause, but the major cause. And so imagine being a 12-year-old. I don't know if you remember what it was like when you were 12. Very impressionable. And,
Absolutely.
and also quite worried about the world at 12. You're just starting to become a little bit of an adult. You're losing some of your childhood beliefs and coming out into the world and writing that meat will cause epilepsy, blindness, a decaying head, inwardly decaying head. And she had the words, and here typeset, as if you put a pistol to your heart and took your own life.
Crazy.
Blamed it on everything. Becoming an imbecile, just a whole lot of scary things, criminal behavior. So here's a young boy. Is it any wonder when he grew up and they paid for him to become a doctor, they paid for his medical education, that his life was spent creating foods to take the place of flesh, meat, milk, and butter and marketed as health food.